Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We don't have much time. Mistrust has a flight to catch, so we're going to go right into it. Some of the things you said about the threat that democracies face from non-democracies, some of which are expansionist, some of which wish to impose their views and their might on other countries, I think resonates with Indians because we feel that way. But here are our doubts. Our doubts are, does the West speak in one voice? What you've said about Putin, for instance, I think everybody agrees with. I think everybody in the West now says that. But only 5 years ago, the United States under Trump was singing a different tune. So how do we trust the West?
Well, this is where I believe India has a huge role to play.
Yeah.
I don't think India is a follower in this. I think India is a leader.
Yeah.
You're the world's biggest democracy, the world's biggest country now by population, an economic powerhouse. And India, as much as any other country, knows the real threat that China poses. So I believe that India can have a huge influence on that debate and also use its economic power to influence the way we all deal with China.
Okay.
And I talked about things like supply chains. I know a lot of companies are now relocating their supply chains to India. I know that India is looking at where you source critical minerals from, your key components from. So, it's a bit of a cliche that we're sort of moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, but we are. And that requires, lots of countries to step up. I think Japan has also a really important role to play as a close neighbor of China, a key Indo-Pacific player. But what we can't do is just assume that if we do nothing, everything's going to be fine. Yeah. And that is what we have learnt the hard way. We were hugely distracted after the Cold War. We really thought that it wasn't going to be a problem anymore, that everybody believed in freedom and democracy, that we could simply let Russia get on with it. That proved to be completely wrong. Yeah. And in order to protect our lives and protect the values we hold dear, we have to all be active in that debate.
You talked about economic power, and that's an interesting one because economic power and political power should actually have some connection, but often we act as though the two are independent of each other. Many companies in the West have invested hundreds, thousands of billions in China and now say we have too much at stake. Do you think in retrospect they were too hasty in doing that?
Yeah, well, as you say, money talks.
Yeah.
Money talks, and we all know that. And yes, we had too much dependence on China. And this is why in the United Kingdom we made the decision to remove Huawei from our telecoms networks. We put in an Investment Protection Act. But we went through a huge period before that of rolling out the red carpet to China. We had a so-called golden era where, despite what had already happened, I mean, things like Tiananmen Square had already happened. There were lots of signs that it was not a wholly benign regime. But nevertheless, when the West, we had this belief, and it turned out to be a naive belief, that with more economic freedom, China would become freer. Yeah. But actually, that economic growth has been used to undermine our way of life, and we have woken up to it now in the UK. I still think we need to do more. We need to do more with our allies, but there's been very much a change in mindset.
Has there, is my question, because you had that big state banquet for the president, which in retrospect was probably a mistake, don't you think?
Yes,
you agree. It was a mistake.
The whole strategy was a mistake.
Okay.
And the UK was not the only country that followed that strategy. It was
all of the West, really.
The decision to allow China to join the World Trade Organization, the way we allowed that to happen. I mean, back in the 1990s, which is an era we keep coming back to, the Chinese economy was the 10th the size of the US economy. We were dealing with something completely different to what we're dealing with now.
But when we hear you say that, and we have many concerns about China and India, I think we agree with you and we feel good. But we just wonder, is this actually the view of the UK political establishment? I mean, the UK government has been very unwilling to accept that China is any kind of threat at an official level, hasn't it?
I think the view of Britain, British society, British business and British government has shifted over time to being much more skeptical about China and much keener to work with our allies to counter their level of economic influence. There's always a temptation, and I think we can see this across Western Europe. There's always a temptation to follow the money in the short term. But what I'm saying is following the money in the short term leads to a big cost in the long term. And that's what we've got to be very wary of, because in the same way that Europe became dependent on Russian oil and gas, we're now all spending money, spending effort. The poor Ukrainians are losing their lives because of we didn't do enough early enough.
Yeah. But I remember when you made that speech in Tokyo, when you talked about many of the same themes that you've talked about today, and you talked about the threat to Taiwan and suggested that Taiwan shouldn't become another Ukraine and China shouldn't be allowed to take it over and the West should defend Taiwan. You were actually criticized in your own country. Jake Berry, a former chairman of the party you're a member of, attacked you for speaking out. So we wonder then, how much of a consensus is there really?
Well, I don't know about Jake Berry's views on Taiwan. I'll have to find that out.
All right.
There's never 100% agreement in any free democracy. In India, I'm sure there's not 100% agreement about lots of issues. The debate is moving in the right direction. I think people are becoming more aware of it. But the reason I made that speech is I do want to shift opinion, not just in the United Kingdom, but amongst our allies around the world, amongst free democracies around the world. So we are conscious about what we're doing with respect to China and with respect to Taiwan. And it's easy to say now, this is an immediate problem we're facing. We should be focusing on supporting Ukraine. We should be focusing on dealing with Russia. But the fact is, China is a much larger economy. Yeah. It's a much larger country than Russia. It is a real challenge that all of the free world face.
Let's move on to Russia, which everybody now agrees is a bad guy. You suggested that the West was a little naive when it came to Russia. Coming to the UK, do you think the high levels of dependence that Europe and the UK have on Russian energy, the manner in which London welcomed every Russian oligarch, they bought up large stretches of London, they became non-doms, they changed the character of large parts of the city. Do you think, looking back, perhaps the UK should have rethought that approach?
Well, yes is the answer. I mean, clearly, with the benefit of hindsight, we ought to have done things differently, and we ought not to have allowed the level of Russian influence in our society and particularly the level of economic dependence. And I think one of the things we've all learnt is how important having a secure, reliable energy supply is. This is why we're now building more renewables in the UK. It's why we're trying to secure more long-term contracts on LNG that are from reliable suppliers. Yeah. But there was in the late 90s, there was an era of optimism. I remember when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and everyone thought, this is brilliant, freedom's going to last forever. A lot of the West, we cut our defense budgets as well. We reduced the amount we were spending on defense. It was called a peace dividend. The problem was that the dividend didn't come through.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's always human nature, or it's often human nature to ignore the long-term threat and have the instant gratification. And that is frankly what we did. And I think it's all very well saying this is a benefit of hindsight, but we now have foresight about the future. So let's do something about what the future challenges and threats we face are.
Some people would say that the belief when the Berlin Wall came down in the years afterwards was that greater capitalism, greater prosperity would lead to greater democracy and greater freedom. That's clearly not happened, certainly not in the case of China and Russia. But what's happened as a consequence is that there's a global financial community which has developed with investments in all of these countries, with interests in all of these countries, which has its own foreign policy, for want of a better word. Is that a possible threat to the world?
I think one of the things that it's always difficult, and I'm a great supporter of the free market and free enterprise, but it's always difficult to explain the difference between that and where you have vested interests and people who don't necessarily follow the rules. Yeah. And I've talked about China and economic coercion, and there are certainly cases where the financial institutions, and we saw this during the financial crisis, did things that weren't in the interests of citizens of the country. And there has to be the holding to account of people making those decisions. And sometimes they're not accountable enough. And I think we saw that in the financial crisis.
Yeah. And we've seen that afterwards, haven't we, as well? In the sense that people don't really hold them to account as much as we should?
I think we've always got to look at the institutions that we have that hold these groups to account. And if you look at the global financial system, some of the global institutions we have aren't working as they should. I don't think organizations like the United Nations or the UN Security Council are not working as well as they should in the new environment that we face. So I think we do need to look at the institutional structure and how we are better able to hold people to account. Yeah. And ultimately, we haven't come up with a better solution than the nation state. So I agree, the nation state has legitimacy. Yeah. Countries like India, the UK, people who are part of them, they're a democracy. And I do think we need to make sure there's proper accountability.
You're in India, you've been Foreign Secretary for many years. You know that if you mention the Security Council, there's always an inevitable follow-up question. So do you think they should extend the permanent membership of the United Nations and India should be a member?
I mean, I think we need to relook at the Security Council. I mean, we're now in a position where one of the 5 members of the Security Council is pursuing an illegal war. Yeah. And that does beg the question about how this institution operates. And I do support a greater role for India, absolutely, as a key player internationally.
Greater role, key player. It's not a yes, it's not a no.
Well, because I think the current structure isn't working. Yeah. So I think just adding to the current structure doesn't address the fundamental problem about how do we create security. And the approach that I'm advocating is an approach of the coalition of the willing working together on their own security arrangements, whether it's the Indo-Pacific Quad, whether it's NATO, whether it's the CPTPP. I think that is a better approach for the challenges we face now than working through the UN Security Council. I don't think the UN Security Council has had a decisive impact on the war in Ukraine at all. I don't think anybody would say it has.
Almost an irrelevance, isn't it? Because nothing has come up.
That's what I'm saying. And I'm saying that the sanctions we put on, we did through the G7 plus our allies. The action that we've taken to support Ukraine with weapons, we've done as a coordination between all the countries who want to do it. The UN Security Council hasn't come into it.
You're on record as having said, and I think you said it here again today, that the West should have allowed Ukraine into NATO when it wanted to come much earlier. And I think you've also said that they should be given fighter aircraft and more arms, which they've been asking for and which the West has been iffy about. Is that fair? Do you believe they should be
So-
arming Ukraine more?
So we should have admitted Ukraine to NATO. And back in 1994, the UK signed the Budapest Memorandum along with Russia and the US, saying we would guarantee Ukraine's security in exchange for them giving up nuclear weapons. And I feel very strongly that none of us have followed through sufficiently on that commitment. We should have admitted them to NATO. I think the Article 5 guarantee is a very important guarantee. This is the idea that there will be an intervention if one of the members of NATO is attacked. I think that would have protected Ukraine.
Yeah.
And yes, we need to send fighter jets. We should have sent tanks sooner. You know, this war will only end when Ukraine prevails. It will only end when Ukraine prevails. I don't see an outcome where Russia wins. We will not let that happen. The question is how long it will take.
Yeah.
And the longer it takes, the more Ukrainian lives are lost, the more the country is destroyed, the more atrocities are committed, and there have been horrific crimes of rape and sexual violence. So I'm very much on the side of getting them all the equipment they could possibly have. And you know, in lieu of NATO membership, which is what they should have had,
Yeah.
we should do that, and we should also fast track their NATO membership now, so we can never let the situation happen again.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about India because we're at the end of our time. Everyone in India, and you speak to anyone in government, has very warm memories of your time as Foreign Secretary because we believe that ahead of all the others, you recognize the importance of India and you tried to forge stronger ties between the UK and India. The trade deal is one example. There is obviously a follow-up question to that. Was everyone in the UK behind you? Because you do know that your Home Secretary said that she was against the trade deal because there were too many illegal immigrants from India, which wasn't even true. And then later, on a slightly unrelated issue, you sacked her, and she was back in office in 10 days. So that kind of thing makes us nervous.
Well, what we have seen is we've seen a huge increase in the number of students coming from India to the UK, which is extremely welcome.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go into the trade deal negotiations, but clearly
Okay.
services and the way that we provide services between our two countries
Yeah.
is really important. And I think there's a difference between issues of illegal immigration, which are very serious for the UK. We've got a problem with small boats
Yeah.
in the English Channel, and making sure that we work with our friends and allies. We've got people with the right skills
Yeah.
coming to the UK, and I'm a big supporter of making sure that happens. And we've got a huge Indian diaspora in the United Kingdom. India has a huge cultural influence on Britain, as well as a huge economic influence on Britain, and I think that's a wholly good thing.
So I'm going to pin you down on that one. Should the issue of people coming across the small boats across the channel, many of whom are Albanians anyway, have been linked to the India-UK trade deal?
I don't believe they're linked at all. You know,
Well, a member of your government did.
There's a question about how we deal with illegal immigration, and I think it's completely unfair and wrong for the situation to continue where people are entering the UK illegally. That's completely different from our system, which is now points-based. It's based on the skills you have, and that's how we should decide who comes to the United Kingdom, as well as having particular arrangements with partners. And I negotiated those arrangements in the Australia trade deal. You know, that is the type of thing we should be looking at, you know, as part of developing our broader relationship with a country.
A final question, because you are in India. Among your many achievements in government, the one I think we've noticed in India is there were more people of color in the great offices of state under you than there ever have been. Did you make a great effort, or did this just happen?
Well, I appointed the best people for the jobs.
Yeah.
That's really important. And I think it shows what the modern Conservative Party is like,
Yeah.
is that those were the best people for the jobs. And you know, we are a multicultural country. You know, we have a huge wealth of talent. We've also got a lot of women in politics as well. And you know, I'm a big supporter of making sure that we have good representation of women. So, but the way the Conservative Party achieved this isn't through quotas. You know, it wasn't through women-only shortlists. It wasn't through, you know, picking particular people. It was about creating a level playing field and making sure we have that meritocracy in the Conservative Party. And I think we've shown we've delivered that, and that is an exciting development for us.
The final inevitable question, how do you think Rishi is doing?
Look, I had a long leadership election last summer. I'm sure it was all being live streamed here. Look, I'm a Conservative. I support the Conservative government. You know, I want us to do well at the election. I'm here in India at the moment. I want to see more Indian investment in the UK, and I want to see us do our trade deal.
Which is a great answer, but not an answer to my question. But I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much.